Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Lost Ships and Lonely Seas, written by Ralph Delahaye Paine and published in 1920. This book looks at the many instances of ships getting lost at sea. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who may not know, this podcast was originally created because I had my own issues with sleep. I wanted to bring another resource to people out there who may have had similar issues to my own, and I am grateful the podcast has built such an amazing community. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you will hear a quick ad at the beginning of each episode. This ad, in addition to the support from podcast subscribers and supporters on Patreon, is what allows me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether it be through the website or your podcast app. A massive thank you to the new subscribers via Spotify for podcasters, and thank you also to existing subscribers and Patreon sponsors. Thank you to all of the Spotify listeners who took the time to leave a response in the episode Q&A. Your responses in Spotify are always appreciated, and the same goes for whichever app you are listening to. On the most recent episodes in Spotify for podcasters, I received thanks from Reed, and also thanks from Joan32. Thank you each for your lovely responses. It really does help out. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support the podcast, there are a few ways you can contribute. Be sure to follow the podcast in your podcast app. Of course, you are also welcome to become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This will ensure that you remove any Spotify ads at the beginning of each episode, and it helps with the creation of each episode. If that is not possible, then an easy way to support the podcast is simply by following the podcast and leaving a review and rating in your app. Even one sentence really helps out. A fantastic way to also say thank you is to share the podcast with someone who may need it. As always, you can find me at boytosleep.com, where you can say hello. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Lost Ships and Lonely Seas, by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 1. The Singular Fate of the Brig Polly. Steam has not banished from the deep sea the ships that lift tall spires of canvas to win their way from port to port. The gleam of their topsails recalls the centuries in which men wrought with stubborn courage to fashion fabrics of wood and cordage that should survive the enmity of the implacable ocean and make the winds obedient. Their genius was unsung, their hard toil forgotten, but with each generation the sailing ship became nobler and more enduring, until it was a perfect thing. Its great days live in memory with a peculiar atmosphere of romance. Its humming shrouds were vibrant with the eternal call of the sea, and in a phantom fleet passed the towering East Indiaman, the hard-driven Atlantic packet, and the gracious clipper that fled before the southern trades. 100 years ago, every bay and inlet of the New England coast was building ships which fared bravely forth to the West Indies, to the roadsteads of Europe, to the mysterious havens of the Far East. They sailed in peril of pirate and privateer, and fought these rascals as sturdily as they battled with wicked weather. Coasts were unlighted, the seas uncharted, and navigation was mostly by guesswork. But these seamen were the flower of an American merchant marine, whose deeds are heroic in the nation's story. Great hearts in little ships, they dared and suffered with simple, uncomplaining fortitude. Shipwreck was an incident, and to be adrift in lonely seas or cast upon a barbarous shore was sadly commonplace. They lived the stuff that made fiction after they were gone. Your fancy may be able to picture the brig Polly as she steered down Boston Harbor in December 1811, bound out to Santa Cruz with lumber and salted provisions for the workers and the sugar plantations. She was only 130 tons burden, and perhaps 80 feet long. Rather clumsy to look at and roughly built was the Polly, as compared with the larger ships that brought home the China tea and silks to the warehouses of Salem. Such a vessel was a community venture. The blacksmith, the rigger, the caulker took their pay in shares, or pieces. They became part owners, as did likewise the merchant who supplied stores and material, and when the brig was afloat, the master, the mate, and even the seamen were allowed cargo space for commodities that they might buy and sell to their own advantage. A voyage directly concerned a whole neighbourhood. Every coastwise village had a row of keel blocks sloping to the tide. In winter, weather too rough for fishing, when the farms lay idle, the Yankee Jack of all trades plied his axe and adze to shape the timbers and peg together such a little vessel as the Polly, in which to trade to London or Cadiz, or to the Windward Islands. Hampered by an unfriendly climate, hard put to it to grow sufficient food, with land immensely difficult to clear, the New Englander was between the devil and the deep sea, and he sagaciously chose the latter. Elsewhere in the early days, the forest was an enemy, to be destroyed with great pains. The pioneers of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine regarded it with favour as the stuff with which to make stout ships, and the straight masts they stepped in them Nowadays, such a little craft as the Polly would be rigged as a schooner. The brig is obsolete, along with the quaint array of scows, ketches, pinks, brigantines, and sloops which once filled the harbours, and hove their hempen cables short to the clank of windlass or capstan pole, while the brisk seamen sang a chanty to help the work along. The Polly had yards on both masts, and it was a bitter task to lie out in a gale of wind and reef the unwieldy single topsails. She would try for no record passages, but jogged steadily and snugged down when the weather threatened. On this tragic voyage she carried a small crew, Captain W. L. Casno, a mate, 4 sailors, and a cook, who was a native American. No mention is to be found of any ill omens that forecasted disaster, such as a black cat, or a cross-eyed fin in the forecastle. 2 passengers were on board, Mr. J. S. Hunt and a girl of 9 years of age. We know nothing about Mr. Hunt, who may have been engaged in some trading adventure of his own. Perhaps his kinsfolk had waved him a farewell from the pierhead when the Polly warped out of her berth. The lone pickaninny is more intriguing. She appeals to the imagination and inspires conjecture. Was she a waif or someone else who was part of some benevolent merchant of Boston who was sending to Santa Cruz to find a home beneath kindlier skies? Had she been entrusted to the care of Mr. Hunt? She is unexplained, a pitiful atom visible for an instant on the tide of human destiny. 4 days out from Boston on December 15, the Polly had cleared the perilous sands of Cape Cod and the hidden shoals of the Georges. Mariners were profoundly grateful when they had safely worked offshore in the winter time, and were past Cape Cod, which bore a very evil repute in those days of square-rigged vessels. Captain Casno could recall that sombre day of 1802, when 3 fine ships, the Ulysses, Brutus, and Volusia, sailing together from Salem for European ports, were wrecked next day on Cape Cod. The fate of those who were washed ashore alive was most melancholy. Several died from the cold, or from the sand, which covered them after they all fell exhausted. As in other regions where shipwrecks were common, some of the natives of Cape Cod regarded a ship on the beach as their rightful plunder. It was old Parson Lewis of Wellfleet who, from his pulpit window, saw a vessel drive ashore on a stormy Sunday morning. He closed the Bible, put his outside garment on, and descended from the pulpit, not explaining his intention, until he was in the aisle, and he cried out, "Start fair," and took to his legs. The congregation understood and chased pell-mell after him. The brig Polly laid her course to the southward and sailed into the safer, milder waters of the Gulf Stream. The skipper's load of anxiety was lightened. He had not been sighted by the British men of war that cruised off Boston and New York to hold up Yankee merchantmen and impress stout seamen. This grievance was to flame in a righteous war only a few months later. Many a voyage was ruined, and ships had to limp back to port short-handed, because their best men had been kidnapped to serve in British ships. It was an age when might was right on the sea. The storm which overwhelmed the brig Polly came out of the southeast, when she was less than a week on the road to Santa Cruz. To be dismasted and waterlogged was no uncommon fate. It happens often nowadays when the little schooners creep along the coast from Maine and Nova Scotia ports, and dare the winter blows to earn their bread. Men suffer in open boats, as has been the seafarers' hard lot for ages, and they drown with none to hear their cries, but they are seldom adrift more than a few days. The story of the Polly deserves to be rescued from oblivion because, so far as I am able to discover, it is unique in the spray-swept annals of maritime disaster. Seamanship was helpless to ward off the attack of the storm that left the brig a sodden hulk. Courageously her crew shortened sail and made all secure, when the sea and sky presaged a change of weather. There were no green hands, but men seasoned by the continual hazards of their calling. The wild gale smote them in a darkness of night. They tried to heave the vessel to, but she was battered and wrenched without mercy. Stout canvas was whirled away in fragments. The seams of the hull opened as she laboured, and 6 feet or water flooded the hold. Leaking like a sieve, the Polly would never see port again. Worse was to befall her. At midnight she was capsized or thrown on her beam ends, as the sailor's lingo has it. She lay on her side while the clamorous seas washed clean over her. The skipper, the mate, the 4 seamen, and the cook somehow clung to the rigging and grimly refused to be drowned. They were of the old breed, every hair a rope yarn and every finger a fish hook. They even managed to find an axe and grope their way to the shrouds, in the faint hope that the brig might right if the mast went overside. They hacked away and came up to breathe now and then, until foremast and mainmast fell with a crash and the wreck rolled level. Then they slashed with their knives at the tangle of spars and ropes until they drifted clear. As the waves rush across a half-tide rock, so they broke over the shattered brig, but she no longer wallowed on her side. At last the stormy daylight broke. The mariners had survived, and they looked to find their 2 passengers, who had no other refuge than the cabin. Mr. Hunt had gone, blotted out with his affairs and his ambitions, whatever they were. The gale blew itself out, the sea rolled blue and gentle, and the wreck moved out into the Atlantic, having veered beyond the eastern edge of the Gulf Stream. There was raw salt pork and beef to eat, nothing else, barrels of which they fished out of the cargo. A keg of water which had been lashed to the quarter-deck was found to contain 30 gallons. This was all there was to drink, for the other water casks had been smashed or carried away. The diet of meat pickled in brine aggravated the thirst of these castaways. For 12 days they chewed on this salty raw stuff, and then the Native American cook, Moho by name, actually succeeded in kindling a fire by rubbing 2 sticks together in some abstruse manner handed down by his ancestors. By splitting pine spars and a bit of oaken rail, he was able to find in the heart of them wood which had not been dampened by the sea, and he sweated and grunted until the great deed was done. It was a trick which he was not at all sure of repeating unless the conditions were singularly favourable. The tiny galley, or camboose as they called it, was lashed to ring bolts in the deck, and had not been washed into the sea when the brig was swept clean. So now they patched it up and got a blaze going in the brick oven. The meat could be boiled, and they ate it without stint, assuming that 100 barrels of it remained in the hold. It had not been discovered that the stern post of the vessel was staved in under water, and all of the cargo excepting some of the lumber had floated out. The cask of water was made to last 18 days by serving out a quart a day to each man. Then an occasional rain squall saved them for a little longer from perishing of thirst. At the end of 40 days, they had come to the last morsel of salt meat. The Polly was following an aimless course to the eastward, drifting slowly under the influence of the ocean winds and currents. These gave her almost a southerly slant, so that she was caught by that vast movement of water, which is known as the Gulf Stream drift. It sets over towards the coast of Africa and sweeps into the Gulf of Guinea. The derelict was moving away from the routes of trade to Europe into the almost trackless spaces beneath the tropic sun, where the sea glittered empty to the horizon. There was a remote chance that she might be descried by someone who was working for the West Indies under a mighty press of sail, with her human freightage jammed between two decks to endure the unspeakable horrors of the Middle Passage. Although the oceans were populous with ships 100 years ago, trade flowed on habitual routes. Moreover, a wreck might pass unseen 2 or 3 miles away. From the quarter-deck of a small sailing ship, there was no such circle of vision as extends from the bridge of a steamer, 40 or 60 feet above the water, where the officers gaze through high-powered binoculars. The crew of the Polly stared at skies which yielded not the merciful gift of rain. They had strength to build them a sort of shelter of lumber, but whenever the weather was rough, they were drenched by the waves which played over the wreck. At the end of 50 days of this hardship and torment, the 7 were still alive, but then the mate, Mr. Paddock, languished and died. It surprised his companions, for, as the old record runs, he was a man of robust constitution who had spent his life in fishing on the Grand Banks, was accustomed to endure privations, and appeared the most capable of standing the shocks of the misfortune of any crew. In the meridian of life, being about 35 years old, it was reasonable to suppose that, instead of the first, he would have been the last to fall a sacrifice to hunger and thirst and exposure, but heaven ordered it otherwise. Singularly enough, the next to go was a young seaman, spare and active, who was also a fisherman by trade. His name was Howe. He survived 6 days longer than the mate, and likewise died delirious and in dreadful distress. Fleeting thunder showers had come to save the others, and they had caught a large shark by means of a running bowline, slipped over his tail while he nosed about the weedy hole. Captain Casno seems to have been a sailor of extraordinary resource and resolution. His was the unbreakable will to live and to endure, which kept the vital spark flickering in his shipmates. Whenever there was strength enough among them, they groped in the water in the hold and cabin in the desperate hope of finding something to serve their needs. In this manner, they salvaged an iron tea kettle and one of the captain's flint-lock pistols. Instead of flinging them away, he sat down to cogitate a gaunt, famished wraith of a man who had kept his wits and knew what to do with them. At length he took an iron pot from the gallery, turned the tea kettle upside down on it, and found that the rooms failed to fit together. Undismayed, the skipper whittled a wooden collar with a seaman's sheath knife and so joined the pot and the kettle. With strips of cloth and pitch scraped from the deck beams, he was able to make a tight union where his round wooden frame set into the flaring rim of the pot. Then he knocked off the stock of the pistol and had the long barrel to use for a tube. This he rammed into the nozzle and the tea kettle, and corked them as well as he could. The result was a crude apparatus for distilling seawater, when placed upon the bricked oven of a gallery. Imagine those 3 surviving seamen watching the skipper while he methodically tinkered and puttered. It was absolutely the one and final chance of salvation. Their lips were black and cracked and swollen. Their tongues lolled and they could no longer wheeze when they tried to talk. There was now a less precarious way of making fire than by rubbing dry sticks together. This had failed them the most time. The captain had saved the flint and steel from the stock of his pistol. There was tow and carry oakum to be shredded fine and used for tinder. This smouldered and then burst into a tiny blaze when the sparks flew from the flint, and they knew that they would not lack the blessed boon of fire. Together they lifted the precious contrivance of the pot and the kettle, and tottered with it to the galley. There was an abundance of fuel from the lumber, which was hauled through a hatch and dried on deck. Soon the steam was gushing from the pistol barrel, and they poured cool salt water over the upturned spout of the tea kettle to cause condensation. Fresh water trickled from the end of the pistol barrel, and they caught it in a tin cup. It was scarcely more than a drop at the time, but they stoked the oven and lugged buckets of salt water, watch and watch by night and day. They roused in their sleep to go on with the task with a sort of dumb instinct. They were like wretched automations. So scanty was the allowance of water obtained that each man was limited to 4 small wine glasses a day, perhaps a pint. It was enough to permit them to live and suffer and hope. In the warm seas which now cradled the Polly, the barnacles grew fast. The captain, the cook, and the 3 seamen scraped them off and for some time had no other food. They ate these shellfish mostly raw, and because cooking interfered with that tiny trickle of condensed water. The days and weeks of blazing calms in this strange wilderness of ocean mattered not to the blindly errant wreck of the Polly. She was a ship that had outwitted her destiny. She had no masts and sails to push her through these acres of leathery kelp and bright masses of weed, which had drifted from the Gulf and the Caribbean to come to rest in this solitary, watery waste. And yet to the captain and his 2 seamen, this dreaded Sargasso Sea was beneficent. The stagnant weed swarmed with fish and gaudy crabs and mollusks. Here was food to be had for the mere harvesting of it. They hauled masses of weed over the broken bulwarks and picked off the crabs by hundreds. Fishing gear was an easy problem for these handy sailormen. They had found nails enough, hand-forged and malleable. In the galley, they heated and hammered them to make fish hooks, and the lines were of small stuff unrove from a length of halyard. and so they caught fish and cooked them when the oven could be spared. Otherwise they ate them raw, which was not distasteful after they had become so accustomed to it. The natives of the Hawaiian Islands prefer their fish this way. Besides this, they split a large number of small fish and dried them in the hot sun upon the roof of their shelter. The sea salt which collected in the bottom of the still was rubbed into the fish. It was a bitter condiment, but it helped to preserve them against spoiling. The season of spring advanced until the derelict Polly had been 4 months afloat and wandering, and the end of the voyage was a long way off. The minds and bodies of the castaways had adjusted themselves to the intolerable situation. The most amazing aspect of the experience is that these men remained sane. They must have maintained a certain order and routine of distilling water, of catching fish, of keeping track of the indistinguishable procession of the days and weeks. Captain Casno's recollection was quite clear when he came to write down his account of what happened. By way of making the best of it, these two indomitable seafarers continued to work on their rough deckhouse, which by constant improvement had become much more commodious. A few bundles of hewn shingles were discovered in the hold, and a keg of nails was found lodged in a corner of the forecastle. The shelter was finally made tight and weatherproof, but alas, there was no need of having it more commodious. It is obvious also that when reduced to 2 only, they had a better supply of water. How long they remained in the Sargasso Sea it is impossible to ascertain. Late in April, it is recounted that no friendly breeze wafted to their side the seaweed from which they could obtain crabs or insects. The mysterious impulse of the currents plucked at the keel of the Polly, and drew her clear of this region of calms and of ancient, fantastic sea tales. She moved in the open Atlantic again, with guidance or destination, and yet she seemed inexplicably to be following an appointed course. The brig was drifting toward an ocean more frequented, where the Yankee ships bound out to the River Plate sailed in a long slant far over to the African coast, to take advantage of the booming trade winds. She was also wallowing in the direction of the route of the East Indiaman, which departed from English ports to make the far distant voyage, around the Cape of Good Hope. None of them sighted the speck of a derelict which floated almost level with the sea, and had no spars to make her visible. Captain Casno and his companion saw sails glimmer against the skyline during the last 1,000 miles of drift, but they vanished like bits of cloud, and none passed near enough to bring salvation. June found the Polly approaching the Canary Islands. The distance of her journey had been about 2,000 miles, which would make the average rate of drift something more than 300 miles a month, or 10 miles per day. The season of spring and its apple blossoms had come and gone in New England, and the brig had long since been mourned as missing with all hands. It was on the 20th of June that the skipper and his companion, 2 hairy, ragged apparitions, saw 3 ships which appeared to be heading in their direction. This was in latitude 28 degrees north and longitude 13 degrees west. And if you will look at a chart, you will note that the wreck would soon have been stranded on the coast of Africa. The 3 ships in company bore straight down at the pitiful little brig, which trailed fathoms of sea growth along her hull. She must have seemed uncanny to those who beheld her and wondered at the living figures that moved upon the weathered, scarred deck. She might have inspired the ancient mariner. Not one ship, but 3, came bowling down to hail the derelict. They manned the braces and swung the main yards aback. Beautiful tall ships and smartly handled, and presently they lay hove to. The captain of the nearest one shouted a hail through its brass trumpet, but the skipper of the Polly had no voice to answer back. He sat weeping upon the coaming of a hatch. Although not giving to emotion, he would have told you that it had been a hard voyage. A boat was dropped from the davits of this nearest ship, which flew the red ensign from her spanker gaff. A few minutes later, Captain Casno and Samuel Badger, able seamen, were alongside the good ship Fame of Hull, Captain Featherstone, and lusty arms pulled them up the ladder. It was 6 months to a day since the Polly had been thrown on her beam ends and dismasted. The 3 ships had been near together in light winds for several days. It seemed, and it occurred to their captains to dine together on board the Fame. And so the 3 skippers were there to give the survivors of the Polly a welcome and to marvel at the yarn they spun. The Fame was homeward bound from Rio de Janeiro. It is pleasant to learn that Captain Casno and Samuel Badger were received by these humane Englishmen with expressions of the most exalted sensibility. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story, and if you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.